Hi, my name is Jennifer Smith Parker, Director of Insights at Biospace, and you're listening to Denatured. In this episode, I'll be speaking with Sergey Jakimov, Managing Partner at LongeVC, and Artem Trotsyuk, Operating Partner US at LongeVC. We discuss how longevity has staying power in drug development if developers stop chasing aging as an abstract target and concentrate on mechanisms underlying specific age-related diseases. Hi, Artem, and hi, Sergey. Thank you so much for joining this episode of Denatured. If you can please introduce yourselves, that would be wonderful.
Sure, absolutely. I can kick this off. So I'm Sergey. I'm one of the managing partners, one of the co-founders for LongeVC 1, now LongeVC 2 as well, as we have moved into our second fund, as well as several other ventures and incentives that we have built in the space, including, for example, Longevity Science Foundation, or a nonprofit that funds early stage aging research and the like.
Right. Artem?
Hi, folks. Artem Trotsyuk, one of the partners at the fund. My domain area expertise is pretty science heavy. I joined the fund about 3 years ago and lead the deals team.
All right, so let's go ahead. So you've described LongeVC as a pragmatic longevity investor. So what does that actually mean when you're deciding whether to back a company, and how different is that from a classic biotech fund that's looking at the same deal?
Artem, I'll actually let you start on this. I feel like you have things to say.
I was going to say you should kick that one off, but all right, sounds good. Not a problem. So I think we were in longevity before longevity was a trend. That's like how I would describe it. And the way we view longevity is, how can you improve someone's health span and lifespan as they get older? And how do we think about aging as a area of disease indication? Because aging is not classified as a disease, how do we help someone live healthier longer with a good quality of life at the end? And that comes in the form of therapeutic and non-therapeutic interventions, tools, diagnostics, measurements, ways in which we can capture the breadth of what it means to be healthy and age well. And so that was the thesis of the fund when the fund was started. And when I joined, we're building that out as practical, pragmatic investing in science, longevity science, that it has to still go through the same hurdle, same FDA regulatory path as every other biotech company.
I think actually this is what I asked Artem to start it off. I think he did it pretty well. Look, back in the days when LongeVC 1 was started, so LongeVC 1 is vintage 2021, right? We saw, it was this interesting moment in the industry where, on the one hand, the longevity space and kind of the aging research and the notion that you should invest in aging research, it did somewhat spin out of traditional pharma-driven biotech. So you were already talking about two slightly different, maybe ideological trajectories, although kind of going after the same thing, but in a slightly different way. But it was still very unfocused, and we saw a lot of capital being wasted in investing in fighting aging, right? So the very early investments in the longevity space were, and a lot of times, money down the drain. And not because the research was inherently bad, but because it was research. It was very early. It was fundamental science. It was not focused. It was not ready to speak the FDA language, let alone proceed to clinical trials with a feasible disease indication, right? So when we started, indeed, I mean, we went after age-related diseases, as Artem already said, right? We went after measurable endpoints, and we kind of view the notion of arriving at a longevity drug, if you wish, not as this hypothetical concept of arriving at a longevity pill that someone consumes and lives longer, healthier, and rewinds the biological age, but rather understanding what are the underlying mechanisms behind age-related diseases, and hopefully also finding that there are mechanisms that are present in several age-related disease categories, right? So once you essentially figure out how to act on that mechanism, you will widen the patient population that you were affecting pretty severely. And this is where you improve health span, right? And that's ultimately longevity for us. We're also pragmatic in a way that we stay clear of hype. We're not really into nutraceuticals. We're not really into anything you would see in the TikTok health advice feed, not something that, your average health influencer would push, etc. Because I'm not saying it's inherently bad. I mean, some of these things are bizarre, right? Some of these things are borderline useless yet safe. The issue is they're not data backed, right? And we're all about data. And I think that the team that Artem has built out has scientific due diligence as its top priority, right? And this is how we designed the fund from the very beginning. So this is where the pragmatic component comes from.
And we get it. Placebo is a strong drug. The placebo effect is real. But then how does that translate into actual product? How does that translate into revenue generation? So very much aligned with the pragmatic approach here.
Both of you make such an important point. And I know, Sergey, when we had our initial conversation, you talked about how regulators, payers inevitably still think about disease by disease terms, that type of a typical clinical trial paradigm that we have. But where longevity, the overarching view, is talked about health span. So what does a realistic regulatory and commercialization path look like today for a startup that markets itself as longevity or going into the longevity space?
Trick question. It is a trick question because FDA is there to stay. I mean, several variables that you cannot really change, right? FDA is there to stay. Data-driven approach and endpoint-driven approach for preclinical IND enabling and then clinical trials is there to stay. It is also there to ensure safety for patients. It is also there to ensure that you are actually affecting something very specific that is measurable in a preclinical and then in a clinical setting. So there to enable phase 4 studies afterwards, post approval observation and the like. So all of these processes are there not necessarily to be disrupted because you need them. Essentially, at least for now, you need them. I'm not prepared to speculate what's going to be what is going to be like in 20 years' time, but for now, we need them. Right. So that's kind of point number one. Number two, I think the realistic, not romanticized path for a longevity, quote unquote, company as of now is still going after a specific disease target, being able to demonstrate a very specific piece of aging biology or a mechanism of action that they are exploiting to go after a specific disease indication in preclinical, then IND enabling, and then clinical. Although I do hate the debate of longevity, people saying, oh, we're not traditional biotech, and then traditional biotech saying, like, what is even the difference between you and us? Fundamentally, if you are trying to go after novel biology, that comes primarily from the aging research, you are absolutely, we're like all hands for it. But the reality of it is the mechanism of you proving your thing works would be essentially similar to your traditional whatever drug that Novartis is putting through clinical trials in oncology, for example, right, which would be considered traditional biotech. That would be my take. Artem, what do you think?
I agree. To add to what Sergey talks about, the payers, the eventual, say a drug is approved, the eventual payers want some outcomes data. So any quote unquote longevity company needs to think about how they're stacking their evidence strategies earlier on. Obesity was not an indication. GLPs made it an indication. So maybe in the future, health span or aging will be an endpoint that could be measured. But because it's so variable for every individual, what is defined as you age, what changes, I can't attribute a timeline for that. But whatever indication in the aging biology someone goes after, there's a mechanistic side. And then a targeted scientific rigor that you're required to just prove that what you're saying is what the science that you're saying is actually going to work. And then you got to prove to the regulators who have systems that are in place since from way back when to go through the check mark to show that your claims are valid and unsafe for people to use. Things like performance, analytics, all these aging related buzzwords or longevity buzzwords still need to go through outcomes, prove that works, real world evidence.
And it is very often a blessing and a curse at the same time, right? Because a lot of fundamental pieces in aging biology, they tend to have much broader claims than your traditional kind of mechanisms of action from, again, quote unquote, traditional biotech. right? If you take senescent cells, which are arguably, participating in a lot of aging related and deterioration related processes in the body, right? Or telomere, any part of kind of the telomere science out there. And that's a blessing, because ultimately, if you eventually prove that it works and it has a place under the sun, then you are claiming potentially systemic benefits for patients. The curse is understanding, well, what is the area I'm going to prove it in, right? Because just making things better is not an endpoint. So this is where a lot of longevity companies were originally stuck. We see them now kind of getting out of that ditch. And essentially understanding that FDA is just there to stay. So there is certainly an improvement if you stack it against, let's say, 2021, 2022.
Yeah, you make an interesting point too, going with GLPs. I remember that's something we discussed like earlier on about how their first real longevity drugs are. So I'm just curious from the GLP standpoint, just to talk about that a bit more. What has that taught you about how future longevity therapies will actually reach patients and fit into pharma's business model? It definitely sounds a bit going along what you said about the endpoints and that traditional aspect and very specific timelines and readouts.
Yeah, so I can kick that one off. Their mechanism, so they dialed in on a mechanism earlier on, and kind of what is that receptor pathway outcome? And if we think about it in the longevity drug space, we can't say like we're targeting aging, because that's not a mechanism. So there was a little bit more thought about what the biology was. Now, the indication agnostic feature, it could be that is a way in which they were thinking about scaling the product. So I think Ozempic started as a diabetes drug, and now it's for obesity, now cardiovascular, kidney, maybe Alzheimer's. And so that seems to me that because they see a market opportunity, that the business model is trying to expand, especially since the patent cliff, I think, for the initial GLPs, or the patent for the initial GLP is about to expire. So thinking about other indications and by ways of modification that could lead to a new revenue stream. So I'd start there. Interestingly, with the GLPs, they've pulled in a lot of oxygen and capital towards this area of metabolic diseases. And so the question is that the right area specifically to be deploying all that capital, or is still other methods by which we can treat cardiovascular, kidney, or maybe Alzheimer's, any brain-related things can be possibly more beneficial. But because of the huge market adoption and the volume of money associated, I think there's many reasons why a lot of investors are excited about this.
Yeah.
I think to chime in on that real quick. So with GLPs, I think it's a perfect example. It's a perfect example of something that started off as a very specific disease indication drug, and then along the way proved to be having more systemic or wider health benefits for a wider potential patient population, or even kind of semi-healthy population, right? People that are not necessarily diagnosed with something yet, or about to be diagnosed. So that's one. Second, I always have to struggle with kind of what does the pharma understand and what does the pharma not understand type of discussion. Because the reality of it is, I think big pharma is they are smart enough. These are smart people. And in order to understand how they think, you need to understand the nature of their business. And the nature of the business of big pharma is distribution of drugs on a very, very, very large scale, and access to markets, and access to patient communities, and access to healthcare providers. Essentially all these sales channels that a small biotech that is developing something will never, ever reach in its lifetime, right? So, and this is why pharma is acquiring a lot of IP, because by the nature of the organizations, it's sometimes too big, too clumsy to move fast. And this is why the innovation is better happening elsewhere, at least the early innovation. And then they can take it from someone else's hands, right? And then kind of push it towards the finish line with a bigger budget, and then the distribution, because the distribution is a huge part of a commercial success of any drug. So in order to enable this distribution engine to actually make you money, you need something very specific with a very specific disease indication to distribute. You need a specific good to be sold. That's it. That's all there is. So the example with GLPs is just an example of what the longevity companies should do from our previous question, like 5 minutes ago. And that is prove themselves in something very specific and then claim a wider health benefit once you've proved yourself elsewhere. And this is how you expand, right? Because now you have the ground that you've built with these initial sales, with these initial kind of distribution channels. And this is how you get big pharma interested. Because then, as a huge distribution business, they understand what to do with it because there is a specific good to sell. So yeah, I think GLP, you can call it the first longevity drug. You can call it a drug that simply lowers a lot of it. It has a ton of side effects as well,
Right.
in all fairness, right? Some studies recently have indicated the osteoporosis risks, for example, together with previously known sarcopenia and all the Ozempic face and whatever risks. But it does have wider health benefits, like cardiovascular risk reduction and et cetera. So it's just a good poster child that we have as of now. I'm not saying it's perfect. It's just a good case.
Yeah, no, I think that makes a lot of sense. I love the idea of putting it as a poster child with caveats, right? With what we talked about, where there's side effects and other things. I'm hearing again and again how important it is to have data behind everything that you're doing and not just a theory, not just an idea about longevity here. So I'm curious, when a founder pitches you in a longevity, let's say, startup. So what are the top 1 or 2 tells, let's say in the first 5 minutes, that you say this could be fun backable and not just a great science project?
Artem, this is for you to start with, for sure.
Sure. So even before we take a call for them to pitch, they'll send us the pre-reading material. People sometimes underestimate the importance of having your pitch deck dialed into the story you're trying to communicate and often not going with the hype of what the current trend is and then sticking all those keyword hypes in there. Very often, we've seen thousands of companies across the last couple of years. And I could tell you the ones that stand out. The pitch deck is the first part in which we kind of screen through to determine if we're going to continue that conversation or not. They'll start with the theme area, and that theme area then we will then say cardiovascular. I'll give it as a direct example. If someone's interested in cardiovascular, and then they'll present their pitch on some new cardiovascular indication. We have the knowledge of we've seen other companies in the same space. And so we'll start thinking about how is it that their approach is the same and or different or unique as compared to what has already currently been tried. Are they trying the same technology from 20 years ago and saying it's new and novel, where actually it's not? Or have they been around for the last 10 years and it hasn't really progressed forward? So there's a lot of filtering and thinking that goes in to assess their indication before drilling in on the science. And the initial screen also will review the data, whatever data they want to present. That does help inform. I think the data component comes more in to conversation when we'll go into diligence, when we'll ask for I'd like to see some of your papers, or published or unpublished. Perhaps you have some reports that you've written internally. Perhaps you have other stakeholders. Perhaps you have some explanation on the mechanism of actions. Then we'll prod that a little bit further to test those hypotheses to say, hey, we think that this and this could be a risk, or this doesn't make sense, or other people have tried this mechanism from a different angle. How does your approach stack against those? Why is yours better? And every single part, especially these science-heavy companies, require a certain amount of demonstration of feasibility. When they're super early in concept, there's a little bit more wiggle room because it is the conceptual framing. When you're further down into like a Series A, going into Series B, and if you don't have much to justify your hypotheses, even cell studies in vitro, large animal models, then the question is whether or not what you're proposing is going to actually transition into being successful in phase 1. But the thing that's super important with all these biologics is there a drug product? There's oftentimes, we see a lot of companies that come in and say, we can generate a bunch of hits, we can generate a bunch of targets, we can generate a bunch of molecules. That doesn't matter, because then the day, you got to have a drug product that comes from all this. I think there was a talk where the head of AI for Eli Lilly was talking and saying, hey, we have a ton of AI models that in-house that we could turn on just like the snap of a finger and just generate a bunch of hits. or a bunch of targets. It doesn't really matter for us. You can generate us lists. We can use those. We can do that ourselves as well. It does not matter. What matters for us is if there is something that you have on the data defensibility, or can you speed up our processes? Can you get us to faster production timelines, or can you get us to the point where we can get into clinic faster? What can you do to help us essentially get to the endpoint of making an extra dollar faster? I'll pause there, see if Sergey has any additional comments there, but that's kind of how I would start framing it.
I mean, absence of wishful thinking. Top one, the only one. No, seriously, no. It's a very it's a like voluminous term.
Yeah.
To be completely honest, like it's a very voluminous factor, and what goes into it is what Artem is talking about essentially, right? But it's also the realistic perception of the team of what it's going to take to actually build whatever they're trying to build. I think biotech is in a way, I mean, it's one of the most difficult industries to invest in, period, right? So you need to be an absolute optimist to invest in early stage biotech. But then I think one of the few perks that we get, very few, is that you rarely get absolutely random people as founders. So they're usually educated, field trained individuals, very often with previous exits or previous pharma background, or you essentially get people from the space building in the space. So it all comes down to how realistic are they about where they are, where they're going to be, their ability to estimate their timelines, their ability to estimate their regulatory hurdles, their ability to be realistic about business development, the way how the team thinks about business development to begin with, right? So where if you see a team which says, well, no, we don't want to talk to the industry yet because we're going to talk with the industry in a year and it's going to be fast. That is something you would probably notice, knowing that the industry takes a year and a half to do the deal with you very often. Right? It doesn't move that fast. Things like that. Same applies, same wishful thinking factor applies to data. Are they trying to see something in the data that is not necessarily there? And I think, a lot of what Artem and his team does is essentially cross-validating a lot of things that we see with either our scientific advisory board or the external network of KOLs we have, because that it is a mandate of the fund not to invest in a deal unless we have obtained multiple positive opinions from these unbiased experts out there. So for me, it's the wishful thinking basket, which then expands quite a bit if you try to break it down to specific components.
Well, thank you, Artem, and thank you so much, Sergey, for joining this episode of Denatured. Very insightful comments. And if you'd like to listen to more episodes, please turn into biospace.com. Thank you.